This presentation describes John Buchan's role in the use of propaganda in the First World War. Information on detailed activities is difficult to find, as many of the records were destroyed. Soon after the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, the British government discovered that Germany had a propaganda agency. David Lloyd George, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, was given the task of setting up a British War Propaganda Bureau. He appointed the successful writer and fellow Liberal MP Charles Masterman as its head. One of the Bureau's top priorities was to foster good feeling and sympathy towards the British war effort in the United States. There were plenty of different ways in which they went about this, but one early manifestation of this desire was the creation of a so-called Author's Declaration, a manifesto drafted by Masterman and signed by dozens of leading figures from Britain's literary and academic worlds. The manifesto declares in unambiguous terms the righteousness of Britain's cause, the sanctity of Belgian neutrality, and the barbarism of the German invader who had so wantonly transgressed this sanctity. The signatories to the declaration included Arthur Conan Doyle, Arnold Bennett, John Masefield, G.K. Chesterton, John Galsworthy, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling, and H.G. Wells. One of the first projects devised by Charles Masterman was the publication of a history of the war in the form of a monthly magazine. He recruited John Buchan to take charge of its production. Published by Thomas Nelson, the first instalment of Nelson's History of the War appeared in February 1915. A further 23 editions appeared at regular intervals throughout the war. Given the rank of Second Lieutenant in the Intelligence Corps, Buchan was also provided with the documents needed to write the book. General Headquarters staff saw this as good for propaganda, as Buchan's close relationship with Britain's military leaders made it extremely difficult for him to include any critical comments about the way the war was being fought. The War Cabinet comprised the now Prime Minister David Lloyd George, the Colonial Administrator Viscount Milner, former Viceroy of India Errol Curzon, the Conservative leader Andrew Bonar Law, still the formal leader of the Tories, and the Labour MP Arthur Henderson, an outspoken champion of the war effort. These figures controlled the covert operations of the British effort in World War I from 1916 to 1918. They held daily meetings to better manage the war. Sometimes 2 and 3 meetings took place in a single day. These 5 men alone were supposedly the supreme governors of the state, but they were not, in any sense, equals. This secret elite is one of several historical examples of a government board with influence not unlike the Renegades Club or Sir Walter Bullivant's confidential meeting in the 39 Steps, as depicted on the dust cover of Blackwood & Sons' original edition. Viscount Alfred Milner was the most important influence inside that secret movement, and Lloyd George had been in the secret elite's pocket since 1910. One politician who was not impressed by John Buchan was David Lloyd George, who as Prime Minister found himself hemmed in by this secret elite personnel. Lloyd George took great exception to an account in Buchan's A History of the War, which depicted a meeting between the Prime Minister and the French Commander-in-Chief General Nivelle in 1916. Buchan claimed that the Prime Minister heard of Nivelle's plan, which had limitless objectives, including the end of trench fighting and victory within 2 days, and naturally fell in love with it. Even in describing Buchan's account, Lloyd George felt he had to rewrite it, accusing him of lapsing into his fictional mood, giving a fanciful picture of my meeting with General Nivelle at the Gare du Nord, where, having heard of the Frenchman's plans for the forthcoming offensive, I instantly caught fire. In fact, John Buchan neither identified the Paris station nor used such florid language, but facts did not stop the Welshman putting Buchan in his place. Truth to tell, Lloyd George had backed the wrong plan. The Nivelle offensive failed miserably, and the shattered French army was riven with mutiny later that summer. This, however, was to have a significant bearing on working relationships and any possibility of honours after the war. On the 9th of February 1917, John Buchan was invited to become director of the newly formed Department of Information. This was an amalgam of three existing entities: the War Propaganda Bureau, the News Department of the Foreign Office, and the Neutral Press Committee, with John Buchan having worked in the first two. John Buchan's approach was to base information for the public on facts, not fabricated stories. It was his gift for quick analysis and his ability to translate the complexities of strategy and tactics into understandable language that continually increased his value to the war effort. Brigadier General John Charteris at GHQ wrote, "Now that we have Buchan in charge in London, things I think will gradually improve in the Press Bureau." Apparently, the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, had doubts about John Buchan's ability to direct the newly formed Department of Information, and in January 1917, Lord Alfred Milner wrote to Lloyd George, encouraging him to meet with John Buchan before deciding on the post. This fits with the general impression that it was Milner who chose the top officials and not Lloyd George. Lloyd George was also concerned with John Buchan's close relationship with the Foreign Office and his friendship with the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey. In May 1917, Lord Northcliffe, who headed the British War Mission in Washington, was concerned that the British part in the war was grossly unrepresented. In response, John Buchan tasked the Department of Information to organise a supply of British news to American and Canadian papers, to arrange showing of war films, to set up the British Information Bureau in New York, to send lecturers to the United States, and to initiate an informal Anglo-American society in London with Gilbert Murray as president. Even Tin Pan Alley joined in when in July 1917 George Cohan wrote the words and music for Over There, which went on to sell over 2 million copies. John Buchan also persuaded the GHQ in France to allocate one of their chateaux that was not in use to be used as a base for visiting American newspaper editors and congressmen who had been persuaded to see something of the British front for themselves to further encourage America's role in the war. This was Radingheim Chateau, and it became known as the American Visitor's Chateau. There is a reference to a chateau in Mr. Standfast, and although not Radingheim, contains a map in the form of a spider chart, which was hung on the wall at Radingheim. Interesting, this same chateau was occupied by the invading German forces in May 1940. On their forced departure in September 1944, the Germans chose to dynamite and destroy the chateau. The idea of commissioning a record of the war on canvas had been Masterman's. Buchan was enthusiastic, and though not himself interested in contemporary painting, was willing to listen to those that were. He arranged for Paul Nash to see Masterman. The result was that Nash, on the eve of embarkation to Egypt as part of a draft, was told that he had been appointed an official war artist on the Western Front. "I hope to hear from Buchan shortly," he told his wife. "Would you like to ring him up and worship him over the phone? He deserves it." Robert Donald was a key member of a campaign to discredit the department and John Buchan. He was the editor of the Daily Chronicle and made scathing attacks on the credibility of their work and on John Buchan's decision-making regarding what they reported and their accountability. He also happened to be good friends with Lloyd George, who was cautious of Buchan, so approved of Donald's appeals to set up a commission to scrutinise the department. As a result of the commission, Buchan was temporarily placed under the command of Sir Edward Carson, instead of reporting directly to the Prime Minister, to whom Buchan had struggled in terms of access. This lasted only a few months until a formal Ministry of Information was created, with a cabinet member at its head. On the 4th of March 1918, the Ministry of Information was officially formed. It took over most of the functions of the Department of Information, except for enemy propaganda, which was given to Northcliffe in Crewe House. Lord Beaverbrook was made Minister of Information, and Sir Roderick Jones, who was the Managing Director of Reuters, became the Chief Executive. Charles Masterman was made Director of Publications, while John Buchan became Director of Intelligence, with Major Harold Baker and Hugh Macmillan, a Scottish Counsel, his chief assistants. In time, the Intelligence Department became known as the Powerhouse. Its business was to receive and digest all information necessary for the work of propaganda, and to inspire a suitable propaganda policy in the different countries. The ministry thrived under Lord Beaverbrook, and Buchan's work in particular was made less frustrating. Following the armistice on November 11, 1918, Buchan was instructed to wind down the ministry, transferring to other ministries any activities that were to be continued. The war had exhausted John Buchan, as it had many others, as well as the country. It was time to reconstruct and heal. In later life, he liked to suggest he had undertaken intelligence work. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I have some queer, macabre recollections of these years, of meetings with odd people in odd places, of fantastic duties which a romancer would have rejected as beyond probability." John Buchan appreciated the views of the conscientious objectors who were treated with contempt by the military and the press. In his book Mr. Standfast, Lancelot Wake is depicted as a conscientious objector who in the end becomes a hero, dismissing popular beliefs that they were merely cowards. Gilbert Murray and Lord Parmoor, with the help of John Buchan, drew up an appeal to the Prime Minister to release 1,500 conscientious objectors still in prison. These two quotes from opposing sides in the war illustrate how powerful the use of propaganda could be.